can't really discuss characters in comic books that have realistic problems without touching on Spider-Man, and what made this character's problems ring true. What gained empathy from readers was the way the various components that went into Peter Parker came into play. We've all seen tons of characters whose parents were killed when they were kids, but before Spider-Man, a lot of them weren't especially realistic. We've also seen a lot of high school students who become superheroes. Yet here we have the archetype for many who would follow. Past or present, few have shown up on sight with the internal monologue of Peter Parker, and this makes for a great lesson in the importance and the credibility of backstory for characters. That's what's coming up. Stick around. Looking back today, the reasons for my childhood fascination with Spider-Man are clear. What creators Stan Lee and Steve Ditko did was to adapt a modern play based on the age-old battle between good and evil. Further, they used those timeless myths and legends to create characters of iconic proportions. This is because tales like those of the Greek gods have an instinctive fascination with us. Conflicts between God and men are parables that intrigue the human psyche and often carry moral lessons which are timeless. Most of us have wondered what we would do with superhuman abilities, and we balance that notion with what we have seen in terms of power and control, changing people, corrupting them, even on a small scale, such as a job promotion that instills the idea of power over others. Spider-Man's adventures were and are utterly symbolic of those questions and conflicts we all strive to understand through the vicarious nature of fiction. If you were to take the base concept underlying all the story components of Spider-Man, a science student bitten by a radioactive spider during an experiment developing abilities akin to a spider, and give it to several different writers, we would potentially get an array of stories. At first blush, it sounds very much like a horror film. And that's what Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, when they first started developing the characters for Marvel, wanted to do, because they were writing horror stories that really didn't have a lot of foundation, romance stories, and they wanted to write, as Stan Lee puts it, a monster that people would actually like and take to and have empathy with. He liked Frankenstein. There have been several adaptations of the movie The Fly. Its concept is almost identical. A scientist accidentally swaps DNA with a common housefly while performing an experiment and begins to take on its traits. The end result in the film versions, 1958 and 1986, not to mention the lesser-inspired sequel springing from both, is horrific. Taking that concept in hand, Lee and Ditko gave it an opposite slant, deciding such abilities might become both a gift as well as a burden. With great power comes great responsibility. Now, Stan Lee said when he was thinking about Spider-Man, he noticed a fly on the wall, clinging to it, and got an idea for an insect character. I tend to think, knowing how the creative process works, that he probably saw the fly because they were interested in science fiction monsters becoming good guys. And instead of turning it into a nightmare, they were often running with a science fiction fantasy series with open-ended possibilities. The train they sparked into motion has endured for over 50 years with no signs of stopping. Great stories begin with a strong concept, a base notion that can be infinitely adaptable. War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, for example, has continued to generate film adaptations, and it has given birth to an extended family of stories since. That's because the possibility of hostile aliens invading Earth is something we haven't completely been able to disprove. If anything, we keep discovering an ever-increasing number of galaxies, estimated at about 100 billion or so at present, which increasingly supports the idea we may not be alone in the cosmos. The breadth of view we add to our concept dictates its versatility. Fact, fancy, or a combination of the two become a stage for human nature to act and react upon. Let's take a closer look at the elements in which Stan Lee and Steve Ditko decorated their stage. Spider-Man is an alias for Peter Parker, and is a way of working through the guilt he carries for allowing a burglar to escape when he had an opportunity to stop him, who later murdered his Uncle Ben. And yet, as traumatic as that event may have been for Peter, the entire infrastructure of Spider-Man is a result of several chemical components and life events already at work in his life. All those things that happen prior to the story, aka backstory, form characters. Just like life, their personal stew of interior baggage from past experiences has brought them to the point where the present story is taking place. It will inform every decision they make in the present circumstances of your story. Past informs the present. Present informs the future. But the future in your story hasn't happened yet. The future in your story comprises the lessons and growth for your main character. Let's look at Peter Parker's past before he became Spider-Man. Peter was a sensitive kid, a science geek. In school, he was picked on by bullies. He's the guy most girls might have talked to about their problems, but were likely to laugh in his face if he asked one of them out on a date. He may be very bright intellectually, but his self-esteem has been beaten down socially by his peers. He's repressed, and there's a reason for that. Dig a little deeper into those reasons, and he's dealing with abandonment issues due to the death of his parents at a very young age, which is why he's being raised by his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. Life hasn't exactly been fair to Peter. He could have easily become an asshole, but he has enough strength of character not to lash out at others due to his unfortunate circumstances. His aunt and uncle played a definitive part in that, as they helped to mold his character from a more mature standpoint than many younger, less experienced parents may have. They were an older couple, which not only means they were more settled, but have a more life experience to draw on. This is a blessing and a curse for Peter. On the one hand, he has the benefit of their experiences and their stability, the kindness of his Aunt May, and the wisdom of his Uncle Ben. It was Peter's uncle who first attributed the famous statement of, "With great power comes great responsibility." Morally, it sounds like Peter would have learned a great deal about human kindness and responsibility during his formative years. The downside is that Peter would not have had the cool parents in the eyes of his peers once he started school. His uncle probably wouldn't have been as active in terms of playing sports or anything else with him. And older couples often don't have their finger on the pulse of current trends or fashion. Any habits he picked up from his aunt and uncle, even the style of clothing he probably wore, would have dated Peter to a time before he was born, making him look and sound out of touch, probably a bit frumpy. These are some pretty large deficits for a kid to overcome, and like most anyone in Peter's particular pair of shoes, his peers never gave him a chance to get up off the mat. All of these things point, and the direction they point in sums up Peter Parker as a morally responsible kid. He used his time in improving his mind, becoming fascinated with science instead of playing sports, is harboring an inner loneliness, the feeling of somehow being unworthy that all those abandonment issues came equipped with, is emotionally repressed, a social loser. Then Peter encounters a real game changer, an inciting incident that would not only change his life forever, but launch the core saga of The Amazing Spider-Man in Marvel's Amazing Fantasy number 15, published in August of 1962. How did gaining those abilities change Peter's life? More importantly, how did the internal monologue carry over and continue to humanize this character in spite of gaining superpowers? Because all of those past experiences don't just vanish. You can't run from yourself, in other words, no matter how much self-sacrifice you put yourself through. It's a lesson in how characters' past affects the present, where the story is taking place. That's what's coming up next time. Until then, do not allow your keyboards to stop clacking. The fate of the world may depend upon it.